Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you back to this room. We are day 2, second working day, and this panel will discuss economy. Well, what do you mean economy? I mean, we are fewer than we were supposed to be on this panel. There's one person is off, so we will probably try to make up to you with brilliant presentations and with general participation in this conversation. First, may I introduce our speakers. Torbjörn Becker, Director of Stockholm Institute of Economy in Transition. Hello, welcome here. And Yuri Romanenkov, Executive Vice President of the Riga chapter of the Riga branch of Stockholm School of Economies in Transition. With your permission, I'll take 3 minutes of your time so that I'll try to present to this audience what will be the topic of our conversation today. We, on average, this forum is dedicated to civil society and to freedom and liberty. And in this sense, we may be praying for them. They are our idée fixe. We think that civil society and development of free society is a value in itself, because freedom is better than absence of freedom. But this may not be a matter of credo, it may be a very much down-to-us matter. It's an open question. Maybe free societies are more successful, are happier and have a better life than non-free societies, than societies that live behind closed doors, maybe free people. There is a maxim that rich men will get more and the poor man will lose more. It's not about money alone. Maybe they live a better life and a richer life because they're free. Because their freedom of will, freedom of choice they enjoy, in the long run, allow them to accumulate material wealth. This, in point of fact, they are the conclusions we reached, the economists reached, and political scientist Robinson in their works. They speak about inclusive institutions as well as extractive institutions. Inclusive institutions, economically speaking, they are ones where society is engaged in or involved in economic growth through these institutions, where human capital, if we use modern language, what is now the language spoken by Alexei Kudrin, for example, former Prime Minister, keeps using it, where human capital can find fulfillment, whereas extractive societies and institutions are the ones that allow a small group of, at the very top, if you will, elites, extract resources from economy, bypassing and sometimes taking away, grabbing away from, and sometimes at the expense of society at large. Since I'm a journalist, yes, and I am working on political history of Russia for many years, I've been thinking to which extent Russia may serve an example of loyalty to this theory, rather a theory that illustrates that this theory is right. But historically speaking, it's not really a very much illustrative example. If we recall the 1990s, where what used to be a Soviet centralized, planned anti-market economy, where Russia had a rapid transition during reforms of the early 1990s to the very basics of market economy, where it conducted what is known as shock therapy by Gaidar. Well, these reforms and the reforms that promoted inclusive institutions of market economy, private initiative, went hand in hand with very low economic growth. This is a fact. They went hand in hand with negative economic growth. First signs of growth, I will remember that, in 1997, where Russian economy first demonstrated 1% growth. And it didn't last long because it was followed by what was known in Russia as economic default, which was just annihilated all this. But this was the outcomes of the reforms. But as often is the case, these things are not necessarily simultaneous. The reforms of the 1990s, their outcomes were postponed and manifested themselves in 1997 and then in the early 2000s, when Russia experienced the effect of the transition to market that happened in the 1990s through economic boom, which may remind you, which on average until 2007 was on like 7% per annum. Russia may never have seen it, at least in the 20th century. And this very same incredible economic growth went hand in hand with political stabilization. And in point of fact, it went hand in hand with this transition from building inclusive institutions and which turned into extractive institutions. It is believed to be true that in 2004, February 2004, Mikhail Kasyanov, as Prime Minister, had to resign. The Prime Minister of the transition, times of transition, if you will, transition from the 1990s to those 2000 of the rule of Putin, when he left the presidential office where the president sacked them. In the lobby, he met Igor Sechin, today's head of the state-owned corporation Rosneft. At that time, if I'm not mistaken, he was deputy chief of presidential administration, and he thanked, that is, as the anecdote goes, he thanked Kasyanov. Thank you very much for teaching us how to rule this country. We will manage on our own later on. It is thought to be true. They say this really was the case. And yes, indeed, later on they managed. This group that just took upon themselves the reins of ruling Russian economy. But Sechin may have been mistaken, because the way they managed the economy was very different from what was the case in 1999 under Kasyanov. Exactly, they switched or transitioned to this extraction type of economy, where they would suppress a private initiative, private financial institutions at the expense and for the better of state-owned institutions. The growing role of the state in economic life. Again, this political stabilization went hand in hand with incredible economic growth, which gave you an illusion that indeed this can be done, because Russia is an oil-rich country and oil prices hiked from $12 per barrel to $150, was it? Yes, if I'm not mistaken. But actually, Robinson claims that short-term growth, yes, can be achieved through extractive institutions too, but long-term it is impossible. So today's situation in Russian economy serves an ideal example to illustrate this maxim: what comes out of the economy that relies exclusively on extractive model of development. Because today's growth in Russia is 1.5%, which is challenged by some economists who say it cannot be as high. Alexei Kudrin said that we will only achieve 1% growth, PA, which is well below Kazakhstan, well below Ukraine, well below, let alone China, US. And maybe it makes no sense to make these comparisons, but this is way below the potential Russia as a market economy, as an oil-rich economy could count on, given the oil prices we have today, which we can see in terms of exchange rate for Russian ruble, and we can judge by the growth rate of the economy. And this is the price we have to pay, as I see it, that we in Russia have to pay for renouncing the inclusive model. But these are all my deliberations as a common man, because I'm not an expert in economy. Although there are many questions that challenge this logic. Look at China, which cannot be named a free society no matter how hard you try. Although China has been showing slowest growth rates in the last, say, since the 1990s. Finally, we have Europe with low economy growth rate. Well, seemingly Europe is a free society. And this is a question to how true is this theory? How good is this approach that allows you to think that free societies at large are more successful and are richer in terms of economically, than non-free society, unfree societies? This is a question we would like to take up, and this is where I would like to give the floor to Torbjörn Becker, who drafted a presentation with slides, and this is what he will discuss today. Thank you. I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid my Russian has been resting for too many decades, and I'll be doing this in English. I'm, as always, extremely grateful to Lena and Yuri for inviting me to these events, and Ina, of course, taking care of all the wonderful arrangements. So it's my really great pleasure to be here with you. I think a lot of you have been round to different seminars in the world, and SITE, where I'm the director, has been arranging these kind of events in Stockholm for a number of years now. And we're also happy that we have connected the school with the Stockholm School in Riga. So it's really a great partnership for us, and I'm very happy to be able to be here talking to you today. So the topic here is economy in global space, which is a little bit on the fluffy side for an old school IMF macro economist, but I'll try to give you a few ideas that I think are quite closely related to what we just heard in the past presentation. And if I was a little bit more religious, I would probably say, excuse me, Father, because I became an economist and not religious, but I'll skip that. But I think I'm one of the atheists that very much agree to what we just listened to, and I think some of the points here in the slides will show you that. Poland 1989. I mean, of course we're in Berlin, but this is actually starting ahead of the Berlin Wall coming down. We just had a celebration in Gdansk, our institute and the network that we work with in this region, where we sort of celebrated the fact that it's 30 years since Poland had its first pre-communist election. And it all started really grassroots, labor union, Solidarność in Gdansk, and this was the result. And that really was the starting point of this magnificent transition and transformation that we have seen since. And I think we sometimes need to take out these more cheerful pictures to remind ourselves where we started this travel. And of course, now we're in Berlin, so it's hard not to put on one of these pictures as well. And again, this was sort of the start of a long journey. And as people keep saying now, the EU is a failure and we have so much problems. I think, you know, maybe at this stage we need a little bit of a pep talk on what's going on as well, the pep talk for the European Union and working together. Unfortunately, here in my slide, pep talk also means that I'm going to be talking about politics, economics, and peace. And somewhere in the middle, you may be left with a global space. I'm a little bit worried, though, that the global space, the best we can do in terms of that is actually local space or regional space. And in that sense, I think, again, Europe is going to be a very important sort of regional space. And I can certainly say that looking around the world, I'm not sure that I would like to be part of any other region than the European community. So I think I want to sort of keep that thought when I'm witnessing all of the destruction and all of the negative things going on also in Europe, that despite these things, we have made tremendous progress in Europe with the extension of the European Union and a lot of other things here. So, there are horrible things going on, but let's not forget that when we talk about what's going on. So how do I see that we actually connect the things, politics, economics, and peace? It's certainly not my standard macroeconomic lecture, and it's not something I'm an expert in for sure, so I'm really happy to take your views and comments and suggestions. But there are very, very clear links, and we have touched on some of the historical events already in these presentations. So let's start with, as an economist, what are some of the important institutions and why did they come about? Well, we all know what happened. We had just the discussion of what happened here in Germany with Hitler coming around. That was a result of the Great Depression, which was basically coming out of very poor economic management. It was poor economic management both at the macro level, so politicians and policymakers didn't know how to deal with the serious economic developments in the US and in the rest of the world. And in many cases, exactly the point of isolating yourself and not cooperating really made this crisis a much, much bigger crisis. The outcome of this was not only that people lost their jobs, their fortunes, but we also had then Hitler and other very unpleasant figures coming up. Hopefully, we can stay away from the worst kinds of politicians coming up, but I think, again, we need to be aware that this has happened before, and we can now see similar signs. So, poor economics basically led to poor politics, in my mind. And then, of course, we had the Second World War. So we had war instead of peace. So this was sort of the reverse pep talk, if you want, that poor economics, poor politics leads to war and not peace. And that's really the issue to think about. How can we avoid ending up in a similar situation today? As an economist, of course, you focus on how do we fix poor economics. Back in the days, the solution was that after the Second World War, politicians around the world realized that economics was really an important factor in leading up to the war. So they sat down and created the 3 Bretton Woods institutions, or at least 2.5, and I'll get back to that. But they created the International Monetary Fund, with the mandate that we should be able to make transactions between countries, and we shouldn't stop these international payments because that would be harmful for all of the economies involved in global trade and global finance. The World Bank was set up to basically rebuild what was destroyed in the war, and it continues to, of course, be a development bank as we speak today. Now not necessarily focused on wars, but building sort of countries and institutions where they're most needed today. WTO was really one of the focus points when the discussion started, because the collapse of international trade that was linked also then to the international payment systems that the IMF was supposed to take care of was not actually set up back at Bretton Woods. Trade was such a complicated political issue that for a very long time we actually had something called GATT instead, which was basically a trade agreement that was what came before then we eventually had the WTO. But that was created much, much later, as a matter of fact. But really, what this shows us is that when nations try to defend their own countries, by imposing barriers, when they stop trading, when they stop exchanging ideas, money, people, that leads to really serious disasters. And these institutions are not today functioning perfect like we heard yesterday. So a lot of international organizations have issues in terms of how they are governed, who they represent, what are the true objectives. But, you know, from an economist point of view, these three institutions are still today extremely important for creating global space and some universal ideas of rules and setting a stage where we can all trade and exchange ideas in a much more efficient way than we would do otherwise. So the question is, if this was sort of an exam to our politicians, the question would be, what on earth did you learn? You have seen this. We have come to the conclusions that we need to build institutions, and what are you actually doing today? Nothing would be good, actually. Instead, they're really engaging in exactly what led up to the Depression or made it worse, and then the World War. We have trade wars today. I don't need to mention exactly what they are. They are in the news all the time. We certainly have nationalism, and people saying that our country first, let's put up the walls, let's not be sort of nice to our neighbors. That's certainly part of the story today. We do have a lot of armed conflicts around the world. We have it certainly in the region where a lot of you come from. And I think at the end of the day, we have mentioned several times now the issue of inequality. And a lot of these issues actually boils down to inequality, but not only the simple inequality that we think of in terms of who owns what or what is my income level today compared to your income level. Inequality has a lot of different dimensions. So it's of course, income and wealth are really the basis of a lot of the discussions about inequality. But then, of course, it is the discussion about what is your level of freedom, how are your rights taken care of, what are the opportunities that you have in your own country or across the world. You know, the fact that I was born in Sweden already gave me a very high income level, but it also gave me a whole range of opportunities that a lot of people from other countries would not enjoy. I get free education and healthcare in my own country, but also with the European Union, I get the freedom to travel around Europe as I want. I could go to the IMF in Washington and work there for almost a decade. So, you know, these opportunities and this sense of freedom, to me, is worth much more than what I have in my bank account when I'm born. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind when people run away from their countries where they basically have no chance to make a good life for themselves or for their family or their close, the people that they care about. So inequality, we have to remember, has all of these dimensions, and they all matter to people. All right, so where do we, what do we make of this? How do we actually create societies that are open, that are uniting people rather than dividing people? How do we make sort of a positive story that brings us together rather than brings us apart? And I think here we come back to something very important, which is how you tell the story or how we create common myths in our societies. I think probably a lot of you have read the book by Harari, Sapiens book. It's a lot about why is our race, human beings, being so successful compared to lions or chimpanzees or other animals. Well, it really boils down to the ability to create common myths that have made people organize in much bigger groups than any other animal group has been able to do. So, you know, monkeys can organize themselves in groups up to 50 or 100 individuals based on just gossip. We can tell, you know, that's a good monkey, that's a bad monkey, and we can remember that. And we can collaborate then in groups that are quite limited in size compared to human society today. You know, I come from a small country, I think. Swedes, we're 10 million. But that is clearly way past the bounds of what the monkeys collaborate within. And somewhere in our history, it was based on the fact that we had a king, or we had the religion, or we had something that we loved and protected. And that made us unite and move in a common direction. And I think today what we're lacking in a lot of places are visionary politicians that can create the new myth where a lot of us that are not religious or maybe not so strongly believing in our king or something else still have a sense of purpose that unites us rather than divides us. And I think this is a very serious challenge in a lot of places. I don't see the politicians in Sweden today telling very uniting stories. I see that the Swedish Democrats, that are the Swedish version of nationalists, just had a 25% poll rating a week ago. You know? So 25% of a country that I think of as extremely liberal and free and well off and equal in so many dimensions, 25% of people in my own country could think that they would like these nationalistic idiots to run our country. I'm sorry if there are any Swedish Democrats around, but I don't think so. I wanted also to get back to Poland, where it all sort of started. The whole transition episode, and especially if you're doing transition economics like me, it started in Poland. So what happened in Poland? And what happened in EU and other places? So this is what happened to economic growth in transition. This slides, if you're in the back, it starts in 1990. The red line here is not actually Russia, sorry, but it's Poland, because I want to highlight that and make it easy to see. The black line in the bottom here, that's the GDP per capita relative to the old EU countries that we saw in the Soviet republics that became independent countries, but not part of the European Union, okay? If you see the blue line, it's the 10 transition countries that actually became part of the European Union. All right, and then the red line here is Poland, and we can skip. Russia is the dotted line here also. So anyway, like Mikhail said, we see the tremendous decline in incomes in Russia here, of course. We see the tremendous decline also in the other Soviet republics. But look at Poland. Poland just had this initial tiny little blip, and then it's just been going up and up and up and up. This is a successful transition story, okay? It's really hard to complain if you have this kind of development. They went from having about 30% of the income levels of the old European countries to having income levels that is sort of 65% of the old EU countries. So this is Poland. Russia, unfortunately, slid down and is now below Poland, but this is not a beauty contest, but anyway. Life in transition. Life is not just about money. It could also be about how long you expect to live when you're born. It's an indication of your health, how your kids are going to grow up. You know. Again, the red line is Poland. They are the outstanding success story here. The average Polish person now lives till like 77 or 78 or something. Russia, I'm happy to say, has increased significantly from some of the really bad years initially. But we can still see that there's this big gap between the countries that joined the European Union and the countries out of the Soviet Union that did not. So, you know, if we're going to talk about success stories, becoming part of the European Union or getting closer to that is not a failure in any of these dimensions. That's for sure. Okay. What is a failure? This is infant mortality, same story as life expectancy. You know, people care about their kids not dying. Again, Poland is doing great. Other countries have also improved. So, I mean, that's the other part of this. All of the transition countries have improved in all of these dimensions, basically. But this is what happened now to liberal democracy in these countries. Okay, again, the red line is Poland. Poland is making this tremendous jump up on this index, so really high in rating of liberal democracy in just a very few years in the initial period. It has a long and very successful run until now, then 2015, when we see this tremendous decline. This is, of course, as we have seen, not the result of Poland doing extremely poorly in terms of economics or health or other dimensions. But I think this just shows to me that you need to understand how you tell the story to people in your country. That it was not a mistake to be part of the European Union. It was not a mistake to be a liberal democracy. It did deliver along a lot of dimensions, and still you want to backtrack in this fashion. I'm very sorry to say that in these ratings, Russia and the other FSU 12 countries are doing extremely poorly. I don't know if everyone agrees with all of the numbers in these ratings, but you know, I think the divide between the black line and the blue line is still telling a story to me that, you know, being part of the European Union is not such a bad idea. And I'm sorry for the Brits that think about leaving us, but you know, that's... So if we go back to sort of the sort of pep talk, I think we have to ask ourselves a little bit about the storytelling part of politics. Who forgot to tell the European or Polish success story in the past? You know, I think we're focusing so much on the problems associated with our region that we forget how extremely successful it is compared to a lot of other regions of the world. And again, I think we need some more visionary leaders and storytellers, and maybe they need to all read the Sapiens book to understand how important these sort of myths are for people. The other problem, I think, connects economics and democratic developments in the EU and some of the discussions that we have here. I'm not going to dive into that very fundamentally, but I think one of the problems with the EU today, and I think also rightly is one of the reasons that the Brits would like, some of the Brits would like to leave the EU, is that if you have too much control in EU institutions, and you try to actually then also grab the resources in terms of taxes and having a big budget, without people actually feeling this democratic accountability, that is going to be a serious problem. That's not only going to be a serious problem in the UK, also as a Swedish citizens, if someone was to say to me now that we should be part of the banking union, where you're going to be maybe see a 10% increase of your taxes to bail out Italian banks, I would certainly start thinking about leaving the EU as well. Because there's no one that I can vote out of office and make held responsible when we have the next financial crisis, when they have idiotic economic policies today. So I think this is the real challenge in the EU today. If you want to have more power, you have to also be accountable to people that vote for you. That's the foundation of democracy. So that is an issue with the EU. I don't have too many more things to say, but I think we need to sort of connect it to the media discussion yesterday. We have to get back to sort of education and being honest and truthful about what is the story here, what is the narrative of the European Union, what is the narrative of the Polish success story, and that's sort of the key to peace and prosperity. I just want to mention that site, we don't only work with Lena and the wonderful school here. We have a network of sister institutes of economists that do research in economics and education throughout this region. A lot of you are probably based in one of the countries here, so go and find our colleagues there when you want to talk about economics. If you want to read about some of these issues, economics and politics, together in this network, we try to do our share of sort of providing facts and not just fake news. So we write policy briefs that are 3-4 pages. You don't have to be an economist to read it. It's really targeted to a general audience. In the last couple of months, I've been writing a couple of these policy briefs on issues that sort of connect economics and policy and also peace, actually. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
If I may, I just have a little follow-up question. Well, I understand that it's a big question, but I still have it. And I understand that you focus more on European Union and specifically on this Polish example. But where does China stand in this picture? How does it fit? Chinese definitely have their own story, which they tell to Chinese society. And what about China?
If you're doing statistics, China would be called an outlier. So it's the exception to your basic model that says that free markets, democracy, rule of law, all of these institutions on average is really good for you. China, of course, follow their own path. And I think, behind that, you have several factors that explain how could China do that. First of all, of course, it's an enormous country. So when they started their transition process, which was not part, again, of these charts, they had lots and lots of labor that were not really efficiently employed in agriculture. So they had this opportunity to move an enormous amount of people into manufacturing and things that were easy to export to the rest of the world. They also had a little bit of a vague view on property rights and intellectual property rights, so they had no problem copying whatever Russians or Swedes or Americans had come up with in the past. So, they sort of bent the rules in that sense. More recently, of course, you also had the fact of their exchange rate policy, which has been a big item, both for the IMF, but also with the US, saying that they're manipulating the exchange rate. So if you keep down your exchange rate, it makes it easier for you to export cheap things to others, but then at the expense of not competing fairly, if you wish. So that's part of the sort of global community discussion with China. So there are different things with the Chinese story that then, of course, goes beyond simple economics, which is about the power of the central system and how they control people and so on. But I'm not the political scientist and I'm not the China expert, so I will stay away from those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Я, если можно, передам слово Юрию. Я думаю, потом уже начнем обсуждать все вместе, а сейчас я передам слово Юрию Романенкову.
And comment. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mikhail. I won't have slides, fortunately or unfortunately, for that matter, and some of my thoughts may be more theoretical, but I think that I will try to talk along the lines that Mikhail and Torbjörn embarked on, because many of what has been said here is abutting at the question of the sources of economic growth. Because Marco Politi spoke about inequality, Mikhail mentioned inequality, and Torbjörn also mentioned it. So we are, after all, talking about the differences between growth and inequality or decline. So I won't take much of your time to have the opportunity of a discussion, but I shall try to evaluate the nature of economic growth, and indeed what questions are you legitimately asking whenever we talk about the economic growth? One of these ways to think about, which is not a universal method, however, one of these methods is three major factors. Number one is the performance growth or productivity growth. Number two is a short-lived or short-term cycle, which some call business cycle, which is growth and downturn, and some call it short-term debt cycle. And the third, probably most controversial, is something that there is also the long-term cycle. So if a short term is about 5 to 10 years, then a long term is about 50 to 70 years. So let us try to consider these three articles in this succession. So the most important factor when you think about hundreds of years, say hundreds of years, even longer than Mr. Becker spoke about, is the productivity growth. To me, for a long time, it was important to imagine for a second, and that's a hypothetical situation, which is not particularly feasible, is to try imagine a world without the growth of productivity. So we're not accruing productivity in labor, capital, and so on and so forth. What does it mean? What would it mean? It means that some would only be able to increase one's quality of life or one's revenues at the expense of somebody else. So if productivity does not grow, then I can only have something better if Mikhail has something worse. So my quality grows at the expense of Mikhail's, which of course inevitably leads to catastrophic consequences in politics. So Robert Solow got his Nobel Prize for describing growth of productivity as the only principal source of economic growth in long-term perspective. And wherever we are, we have a productivity growth. Take China is a gigantic example, but there are also counterexamples, such as Italy, which there has been no productivity growth of productivity in the past 20 years, for that matter, which in part may be explaining things happening in Italy. So what is the source of productivity growth? Because productivity is a very abstract notion, and there are no units to measure it. There are only the growth rate units for measurement. But the insight of Robert Solow was, of course, the technological development. This was the major factor. Science is developing, R&D is developing, and with the same kind of capital and labor, we get more goods and services. That being said, whenever we think about the specifics, whenever we're reading news or talking to anybody, we can see great technological variety around us. We are surrounded by hundreds of different devices in this room. We probably have about 100 people, that we have 100, at minimum 100 computers, we have screens. This reminds me of a joke, which is a long-time joke, that we're seeing computers and digital technologies around us everywhere except for statistics, for productivity, because there is no coherent and concise understanding how do digital technologies influence macroeconomics. Although there is no negative effect either, however, macroeconomists don't have much to say about the exact nature of the effect of information technologies on the macroeconomics, for that matter.
On top of this, there are a great number of other matters which I'm sure very close and interesting to this audience. This is what Torbjörn discussed much more elegantly than me. Such things as the quality of public administration, which certainly serve as an explanation for a difference. This is the quality of workforce, which is determined by how well educated they are, how healthy they are, and it all boils down to these political and social matters we've discussed. But anyways, one of the most important messages I would like you to remember, these take-homes, that when we just consider long-term trends of the countries, regions, and anywhere across the world, we must first and foremost discuss growth of productivity. When we think of how we will live, what kind of life we'll have in some 30 years' time, we should consider what will be the technological progress then and what institutions would stand behind it. The other remaining two factors maybe are more technical, so maybe I will be paying less attention to them, but just a brief touch upon them in passing. As to short-term debt cycle or business cycle, I'm sure many questions will be asked when the next recession will be upon us. I don't want to go for predicting the time the next recession hits us, but one thing you should consider when you think about short-term fluctuations, where productivity produces a long-term effect, then the short-term cycle that lasts from 5 to 10 years, this is one most important detail, is that this world has changed greatly after the global financial crisis we saw 10 years ago. In what? Addressing the problems that were created by this global financial downturn, the solution lay mostly in central banks, in their monetary policies. And we are now at a situation where we think when the next recession hits us, especially in European countries, but surely it will fall upon us, it's for sure. We don't know when, but what we do know that our arsenal, and there's an amount of powder, sort of gunpowder, in monetary policy has been expended. It means that the only thing we can do that is left to us is to do with fiscal policy, such as taxes and state expenditure. What does it stand for? It stands at all the questions that Torbjörn asked. How prepared he is in Sweden to finance salvation of Italian banks. These questions will become even more relevant during the next recession. Why? Because fiscal policy that has to do with expenditure and taxes, will play a much greater role than it was before, when we had the luxury of going for monetary policy. Nowadays, when we have zero or below zero interest rates in Europe, we no longer enjoy this luxury. This is something that has to do with short-term cycle. Lastly, probably the most contradictory, least understood by economists. Some economists consider that we have what is known as long-term debt cycle or credit cycle, which means that in long-term perspective there are long periods when debt load, which means people have to pay the debts, both households and companies, governments, and you name it, that debts rise faster than economy at all. It means that debt reaches a critical point where it is supposed to go down in some way, and one of the explanations of the global financial crisis was that we reached a point when it became too large and it started to collapse under its own weight and it needed to go down. How can we go down? There are 4 ways to do it. Firstly, they are understandable even at household. First, spend less. Think if you have debts on credit cards, please make sure that since your expenses do not rise, and be sure to cut them. And many governments in where I live now, I'm in Latvia, have been using very actively. They say, let's shut down all hospitals, for example. Let's cut salaries and to all who work for public sector. And this way we will try to decrease our expenditures. Secondly, default. We would refuse to pay on our debts, both governments and companies, and you name it. Governments are very keen on this, especially in Latin America. We had fewer cases in Europe. Our former colleagues who worked for WMF, they work hard to prevent it happening. But this is one of the ways to get rid of this. It's a very controversial way to cope things, and of course the creditors are very unhappy about this and dislike it strongly. Third way to cut down, we go back to fiscal policy. This is distribution between those, the haves and have-nots, between the poor and the rich. Because this sort of distribution can help cut down on when people cannot just service their debt. This, as you can imagine, is a very controversial way when you want to raise taxes, and greater distribution of public goods is not something very trivial, and like Torbjörn just mentioned. And lastly, this is what the central bank suggested, which can switch on its money-printing device. And some of these ways, such as, for example, will necessarily lead to inflation, especially if it's used irresponsibly, which was the case in the early 1920s. You will lead to hyperinflation and all the negative sequelae. Other things, such as, for example, spend less or default on your debts, this is deflation. For example, in Latvia, in 2009, led to a GDP loss of 2%, which is almost tantamount to Great Depression. For that matter, they coped with great deflation, mostly using deflation mechanisms. So the solutions and decisions that need to be taken to support economic growth through this cycle, solutions are just trying to balance here, because all the ways I've been discussing may be very contradictory. They may lead to conflicts, they may lead to populism, they may lead to all kinds of things that will promote further tension. This is what Marco discussed in his presentation and Torbjörn discussed, because all these instruments are far from creating winners, those who win and those who lose, and those who would be losers would strongly dislike it. So what I want to end in is the role of institutions and public sector is about, again, as was put by previous speakers, trying to create the unity. But unity in my case is, when I say unity, I mean coordination between these diverse, potentially hurting mechanisms. Because if some of these solutions are well coordinated, well, we could avoid it. It means that the governments should work hard trying to coordinate with central banks. It means that governments of other countries should coordinate their efforts with one another, and this unity of pragmatic understanding that there is a common solution, but it's all based upon coordination. This is probably something that may help us, but help with long-term and short-term cycles, and secondly, sustain this atmosphere for long-term growth in productivity. I said I would be brief, but in point of fact I was not very brief, so I apologize for that. Probably this is it. If I may, can I just have some matter just to clarify? When you said that this is something that without growth of productivity you will be raising your well-being at my expense, as you put it, but it's obvious that this assertion is global in a sense that it says a lot about the global condition of the economic growth. But when we think in smaller categories, sort of, can I, as an oil economy which is selling its resources and exporting them, can I create without scientific progress? Just because I, in point of fact, will be just, as we put it in Russian, sitting on the sack full of black oil, gold, that is oil. How feasible is this? How viable is this strategy? I mean Russia here, but I suppose Russia is not alone. I suppose here it all, again, has to do with the simple concept that long-term, if you don't have scientific progress, then capital and workforce will not put together, create greater number of services and goods. Your pie will not grow, if we will. When we spoke about extractive institutions, that will continue redistributing the existing resources, and that will be it. And the only way to make the pie greater is through growth of productivity. In long term, it means through scientific progress when with the same amount of capital that you enjoyed last year or the same number of working hours, you would create more goods and services, because this is a very simple concept. Firstly, you have to think how big your pie will be. If your pie doesn't grow, then, well, take out the chunks of this pie from one another. That's it.
A quick remark on that point. There is an interesting study coming out of the World Bank every now and then, which is called The Wealth of Nations, where they try to figure out how much are your different assets in different countries worth. So they break it up in natural resource wealth and some other things, and then they have a residual called sort of human capital or something fluffy. Okay, so Russia, in this comparison, of course, has about $50,000 per person in terms of natural resource wealth. Sweden, where I come from, have basically nothing. But the thing is that when you do the calculation, a modern economy like sort of Sweden that has no resource wealth, the human capital that goes into our production is valued at $500,000 or $600,000 per capita. You know, so it's just an order of magnitude larger than whatever resource wealth a country like Russia has. You have to be a really tiny country. Norway would have a lot of natural resource wealth because they don't have to share it between so many people. But for a country of 145 million, you know, you need a lot of oil to get up to $500,000 per capita, and Russia is not there.
Давайте, пожалуйста, начнем дискуссию. Да, я вот видел, что сначала там... вы.
I saw you be the first to raise.
School. For Mr. Becker question, you were talking about myths. Could we say, looking back, everything that happened in Sweden for the last 10 years, for instance, that the Nordic model was a sort of myth that was deconstructed step by step, and perhaps it was exquisitely described in the Stieg Larsson's work. And could we say that Nordic model might have been the myth of Cold War? And if it exists anymore with its substance, what is the sustainability, future sustainability of that model concerning migration and demographic challenges? And I'm glad that you have mentioned this elephant in a room called Swedish Democrats, because I would assume that Swedish Democrats you know, simultaneously with the existence of Nordic model have not popped up suddenly, all of a sudden, to this 25% of support within the Swedish society that always has been praised as society of equality, society of respect towards minorities, including ethnic ones. Thank you.
Как мы поступим? Мы сначала соберем несколько вопросов, да?
Shall we collect several rounds of questions, or do we want to go question by question? Is that the way? Okay, please, you now have the floor. Well, still, I think I'm Ginsburg from Kaliningrad. I still think that economic growth, when you speak about Europe, mostly relies upon institutional base and not on labor productivity. What I mean institutional base, I mean parliament, that other institutions and free press. Otherwise, you will see many things that will go wrong. Technocratic aspects do not work here. We're not Singapore, China, South Korea. Colleagues, remember 2003 when the presidential address, where Vladimir Vladimirovich spoke about the need to double GDP? Remember? First, we thought, let's catch up Portugal in 2001. That was our goal. Well, and he was saying that the living standard, people's living standard would improve. Well, it has, it has. We know the list of these people whose living standards have improved. It's not so much about productivity and doubling the GDP. The problem is about fair distribution of the added product. It won't work without institutional base. The economy doesn't work, this economy of growth. Look, remarkable idea, Moscow, institution of the economics of growth, economics, named after Stolipin. It doesn't work because it's under the patronage of the presidential administration. The governments can't really kiss you below the belt and hit you hard below the belt. It won't work, you know. It's such a sad story when we have Afro-American standing by and the African is drinking and milk and say, guy, it won't help you it won't help. So even if you drink lots of milk. And now so much for what Torbjörn said and the questions that were raised by my colleague just now. It had to do with Scandinavian model. So in what has to do with this brotherly Sweden, why am I saying brotherly? Because I suppose they have brilliantly implemented Menshevist model of social economic model of life, which in point of fact was invented by Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov. I believe they have a very strong, first of all, humanitarian aspect, where, first of all, they put the best stress on developing human capital. And the European crisis, of the EU crisis, which started to sort of nearly collapse, it had to do with this technocratic approach. Why? Because this is where the focus was mostly not so much on human capital, and instead on global space. Technocratic approach doesn't work in the 21st century unless they rely upon human capital. And this is supported by outstanding technocrats that were appointed to many Russian regions. What have they got rather than a fake or imitation idea with KPIs? Look at how living standards are declining and real disposable incomes are just plummeting. So I suppose I would like to start polemics with Torbjörn. In a sense, I suppose we need to focus most, if we want to keep the EU in place, if we want to ensure its viability, we need to create and promote and adopt into European minds model of the desire of the shape of things to come tomorrow, of these aspirations for the future. Although nobody would dispute the Japanese proverb, if you want to even make the mice who live in your attic laugh, just make plans for the future. But nevertheless, this technocratic approach we've seen dominating in the last 20 years. Any dream is your most cherished thought, most cherished ideal you wish to attain. So I would first like to discuss this lobbyism about this school, which played a great role in social and economic model of my home place. Yelena Mikhail and Yuri Petrovich in mid-1990s held a number of seminars in Svetlogorsk near Kaliningrad, where they brought outstanding scientists, and Alexei Mikhailovich Solomin, he has passed away, when I was responsible on passing the law on special economic zone, as instructed by the then governor. On the 31st of January 1996, we were the first Russian region to be recognized as the free economic zone, and this is where the school played a huge role in passing this law. In many ways, it is because of this that we remained, first of all, as part of Russia. We now see middle class, we saw small and medium business, and people are now doing, because here I have my friends, a well-known lawyer, Kirill Ivanov, Nikita Kuzmin, chief editor, and they at that time were very young, but we should know, all those present should know about this. At that time, for that matter, the Swiss, it was not the Germans, the Poles, the Lithuanians who were first in terms of the number of investments that would create single industry towns with Swedish capital. Nowadays it's gone because technocratic approach is dominating. So I suppose this is important, especially on the eve of, I suppose we need to get ready for that, of the 30th anniversary of this school of civil society, which goes hand in hand with 300 years anniversary of Immanuel Kant, and of course school will survive existing regime in place in Russia. Thank you. Well, this is a remarkable example how human capital converts into real economic growth. This is witnessed by Kaliningrad region. I suppose we'll take 2 more questions and then our panelists will answer them, and then we'll continue. Елена Галкина, Moscow, Dnieper. That is Dnepropetrovsk. Question for Dmitry Romanenkov about these ways to cut down on debt burden is announcing a default and putting on this printing machine. Recently, Ukraine saw opening overtones window towards printing money. I would like to hear the opinion of the distinguished experts. Could you share examples of successful resolution of this problem if they start to print more money? Well?
Thanks. John Lloyd, the board of the school. I'm very glad that Torbjörn made in his talk singled out the real problem with actually with Brexit, and that the basic reason, there were many reasons, but the basic reason was the feeling that there was no democratic control, or too little democratic control. The major slogan, "Take back control," was largely interpreted, and was meant to be interpreted, as take back control from the institution which didn't allow any kind of response, or didn't have any real voting power. And that's, I think, why Brexit succeeded. Though I think it was a bad idea, but nevertheless, that's, I think, the main reason why it succeeded. This is particularly important for the euro, of which neither Britain nor Sweden are members, but which most of the EU countries are. And there, clearly, a large amount of the power that a government has over monetary policy, over interest rates and so on, has been handed over to the European Commission, the European Union, and of course voluntarily, this wasn't a takeover, on the understanding that the euro would be better in the long run for their economies, which clearly has not been the case for some, at least, especially Italy. Is your view the same as a number of economic commentators like Martin Wolf and Stiglitz and so, that the euro is in the long term doomed because it hasn't got fiscal backing, it therefore hasn't got governance backing, there's no government behind it, and hence come the next recession, then it's bound to fail? Or do you think it can carry on? My other question, briefly, really is to Mikhail, but also Yuri might want to come in, and that is when you said earlier, we were talking earlier about the first years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's always been a question since I was there at that time, which has somewhat bothered me, and that is that the Gaidar reforms, which came in, really only lasted for a year when Gaidar was temporary prime minister, could they have been put into the Russian economy, legislation, society better had there been a president more active? I mean, Yeltsin in some ways was great, but he was inactive, to put it politely, for much of his presidency. Do you think that it could have been different had he been more forceful about free markets, about the need for reform and so on, than he turned out to be?
I think we'll start with Torbjörn, and then with Yuri. If you remember.
All right. Yeah,
Yes, you do.
I put down some notes,
Okay.
and then you can judge if I actually understood the questions correctly. I think it's easy to start with the Swedish myth and the Swedish model, that we had some questions, and sustainability of the Nordic model. The thing is that the Nordic model, in my mind, is really about the welfare system that is sustainable. A welfare system that will make sure that we can actually pay the pensions, we can keep the health care, we can educate the future generations. That's sort of the foundation of what is, to me, the Nordic or Swedish model. For some other people in Sweden, like the Swedish Democrats, the Swedish model would be that you dress up for midsummer and that you sing the right songs and you have the right skin color, or a lot of nonsense that is not really part of the Nordic or Scandinavian model in any fundamental or economic sense or political sense. So then the question is, what makes it sustainable, the Nordic model that I'm discussing? Well, it's a balance between the taxes that you get in and all of the services that you need to deliver, and that you have a balance between these two. And in an aging population, what is the solution to this issue? Well, it is probably migration. But if you have people coming to your country, for them to contribute to your welfare system, they have to be put to work. They have to find a good job. They have to educate themselves. They have to eventually then start to pay taxes and contribute to society. So, for me, the sustainability of the Nordic or Swedish or whatever model we call it, is fundamentally based on making sure that all of the potentially productive people become sort of productive and paying their taxes and feel that they are included in our society from an economic point of view, and then they can go and sing whatever songs they want when they drink their vodka. I don't really care. But they pay their taxes, they don't cheat, they don't engage in criminal activity, which they tend to do when they don't get the regular job, So that's our challenge. Get the people that come to Sweden into the Swedish labor market. We will live happily ever after. But without that part of the integration process, it's going to be a failure. So that was that thing. The euro is doomed kind of discussion, I think, comes back a little bit to the distinction between monetary policy and fiscal policy. So the problem with the euro, I see, is that it can drag on and on and on for quite some time, because you don't necessarily have a bailout at the end of the euro all the time. I mean, we had some discussions with too much debt in Greece and so on. The euro is going to come under severe pressure if we have a financial crisis that requires serious fiscal resources to bail out the financial system somewhere in Europe. And that's where I'm not a big fan of Sweden entering a banking union, because it's actually much worse entering the banking union than to enter the euro. The banking union comes with much greater fiscal implications. And again, fiscal is really what ties you into the democratic system, accountability, voters, and so on. You know, so you can sort of fiddle around with monetary policy in the background, and voters don't really understand that. Yeah, it is a bit of fiscal in there for sure, but when it really comes down to saying, sorry, public debt of Sweden just jumped 10% because we bailed out Italian banks, you know, any politician involved in that is going to be dead forever. So that's.
There was also a question, I think, about the myths and the myth of Cold War, as an example, wasn't it?
No, was it Nordic model, the myth of Cold War?
Okay. That's it.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Я тоже, наверное, прокомментирую.
Probably I'd like to comment on these two questions, and maybe those questions about default and printing press. I, under no circumstances, I don't feel that I'm up to Torbjörn as an expert here, but as an external observer of this Nordic model, it seems to me that probably one of the paramount challenges for this model, which indeed is built along the lines of great redistribution, and this is a welfare state, how will the society learn to manage diversity? Because historically, you know, Nordic countries were far more homogeneous as culture compared to other European countries, compared to the US especially.
Up until mid-century, this was certainly the case, and the declining homogeneity and indeed rising heterogeneity, I would personally, for instance, find it easier to pay taxes to a government that looks like me, talks like me, sings like me, and visually speaking, if it's a different kind of government or a different kind of situation in a society, then apparently a society must somehow cope with this. So I do not readily believe that this is something very overly dramatic, but certainly it's a step that a society needs to make if we're seeing heterogeneity to rise. And certainly I'm not going to in any way purport this to be a true statement, but it's just my opinion. Concerning Euro and Eurozone, I agree entirely that I agree that a lot of risks are related directly to fiscal policies, and that we will be, whenever we come across the actual need of great fiscal redistribution, it certainly reminds me of the fact that fiscal policies are often a lot more sensitive than monetary policies, for an obvious reason that people, including many economists, don't quite understand how do money and credit act. So the central bankers, who are sort of the high priests of macroeconomy, have relatively easy time to centralize monetary policies than to centralize fiscal policies. And I think this is really the case with Eurozone, where we have centralized with more or less successfully the monetary policies, but we may not have really understood to what extent shall we need to centralize fiscal policies. And I think that in this sense, we have already passed the point of no return, and that we will have to somehow coordinate our fiscal policies. And as to the default and the emission, monetary or financial emission, when I talk about the default, there are different kinds of default. When we talk about sovereign default, then probably there is discussion about it. It's hard to quote any particularly successful examples. And the classical example is that macroeconomists usually have four kinds of economists: developed, Japan, and Argentina. And Argentina is really the example when these defaults have happened so often, and we are not seeing any great rise over the past 100 years in Argentina. I mean, defaults are not necessarily by governments. They may also be by people on mortgages. This may be also a default of companies on the corporate debt, which is, of course, a big part of the overall economic downturn. So we really have to make a point that all of such events may lead to deflation. So part of the political decision should be to try and counteract these detrimental tendencies, including, in some cases, inflation instruments. Just a few words. I will try to. I'll try to say it in Russian. It'll be just faster. We've seen slides on Poland, the path of Poland, the path of Russia, and indeed, I mean, my heart bleeds when I see what is happening to Russia in terms of comparing the pathways of development. And indeed, Polish example has been and was a big example for the Russian government formed in 1991, and it was in all Russian newspapers. Polish experts were sitting through the meetings in Moscow. Czech experts were coming, but Poland primarily was the example that Russia was to follow, and of course it never worked, and the questions are still being asked why it didn't. But the reformers, or the economic reformers, would say that, all right, Russia is not Poland. Russia is a very different place, a different geographic expanse, a 70-year history of no private property, and of state terror, and many other arguments will be quoted. Vladimir Gelman, a political scientist, may well say, if he's asked, that a great mistake in autumn of 1991, at least that's what he writes in his book, that when in autumn of 1991 the Russian government, the new Russian government, was dealing with with economic reforms rather than political reforms. And instead of speeding up the legal reform and constitution, President Yeltsin decided quite differently, and no reforms were indeed implemented. So the Soviet vestiges have stayed, and we could see how the program of economic reform was given primacy over institutional reforms. Well, I have to some degree a doubt if this is a realistic view of events, and that the then Russian government was at all capable of conducting meaningful democratic and legal reforms. At least I do not really know to what extent, and I'm not certainly sure that this resource the government had, and Mr. Yeltsin himself later acknowledged that it had been his mistake that he didn't call the elections immediately after he was elected president, and because the Soviet Union and then Russia were already broke, they had to act fast. Well, it's still a rather open question. There was a recent publication by Kirill Rogov on the anniversary of the events of 1993 in Russia, where Mr. Rogov compares the attitude towards the reform and indeed pro-Western, pro-reformist coalition creations in Russia. And he is comparing the experience of Russia with that of the Baltic states, as well as the Ukraine and some Eastern European countries, and Russia is certainly lagging behind and is an outright loser in this race in terms of the institutional reform, even at that time, at the beginning of the 90s. So whatever was starting to happen within the Russian government at that time is open to interpretation, but one of the myths which was very well spread at that time is that whenever the Soviet government falls, we will live well. And of course, this myth never materialized. And even before the reforms started, but there was already the great opposition to the reforms in the Supreme Council, the then Russian Parliament, and within the Congress. The Russian elite immediately was divided, was split, and the question that was the opposition between the Parliament and the President were immediate. And President Yeltsin was saying that, well, if you trust me, then we have to follow. So this absence of trust was one of the most important factors in the systematic failures of the Russian government in these years. But still, as I say, the question is certainly open to interpretation if the Russian government at that time could follow a different path. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Artem Filatov and I'm from Moscow. I would like to ask, as you were talking about like global trends in the economy, about global space, we are now seeing that the economy is in kind of a transformation phase, reshaping phase, as we see that many traditional jobs are declining now, like shop assistant, delivery jobs, jobs at the factories, because there is more robotics, more automation, and also there is a huge growth of like VR, yes, virtual reality, huge demand, I would say, for virtual reality specialists and artificial intelligence specialists, etc., etc., etc. And we also see growing digital consumption, not only traditional consumption, but also digital consumption, and much more trends like this in the economy. They are playing much bigger role, definitely. And many traditional sectors are now in the decline. So what do you think? What does it mean for the economic growth and for the societies, these trends, how significantly they would change or already change the economic models and society models? Thank you.
Если можно по-русски, Михаил у нас очень талантливо пытался развернуть в сторону политологии. Я все-таки хотел бы к экономике вернуться.
If I may turn to the economy, my question is to Yuri. And productivity was certainly a concept that we remember from your presentation, and there was a lot in your presentation that for some reason sent me back to the old school books on political economy. Productivity is important, but productivity must bring rise to entrepreneurship. This school, and indeed Yuri Sinakosov, is always calling us to be specific in our examples. And the basis for the Swedish economic miracle, after all, is also to a large extent explained with the legendary Swedish entrepreneurs, the 200 families, after all, Erixons and you name them, who in many ways accounted for this Swedish economic miracle. Mr. Petrov, Sergei Petrov, is an expert of this school, one of the leading Russian entrepreneurs who told us a number of times that the investment is not only about money. If it's not an entrepreneur who is well protected in the country where he lives and leads business, it is very important. Let us not forget about the economic freedom and freedom of enterprise. Thank you. Alexei Gusev from Moscow. A lot has been said about the need to have political reform in Russia before the economic reform, which was never done. However, it appears that there are some circumstances which are not taken into account with respect to Russia. But the difference between Russia and Poland is not only about the geographical expanse and the history, but also economically speaking, but also because Russia is an extraction-based industry. No extraction-based economies are democratic today in terms of the old Soviet or pro-Soviet regimes. None of these raw materials-based economies have become democratic, and if I remember right, $8 per barrel of oil was the level of oil prices in the 1990s. And when we look at what was happening towards the end of the 1990s, it may be that it was not Mr. Yeltsin who chose for Mr. Putin, but rather a progression in the Russian society towards a certain social contract. And in the countries where raw materials play such an important role, let's take Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is a 100% totalitarian state, pretty much like North Korea. So in a way, this comfortable social contract was a logical result of the raw materials dependence of Russia, whereby the government said, we are not meddling with your business, and you let us do what we do. What this Dutch disease problem, this mineral royalty problem, to be resolved? Are there any examples in the last years that we can refer to? Because it appears that this is one of the most important issues for Russia today. Georgy Chizhov, the Ukraine, Kiev. These were very interesting presentations, but if I may go back to the question that Mikhail mentioned, how do we relate the material wealth of a society with the freedom of the society? When we lived in the Soviet Union, it was clear. The golden billion countries were the democracies with liberal traditions, and the authoritarian countries were living worse or had a lower level of life. Whenever we talk about today's situation, we see a very different picture. You take the example of China, you take some other states where the growth of material wealth and economic prosperity may be sought through other instruments and other political formats. The other thing is probably about the narrow horizon of such changes. Yuri, when he spoke about productivity, probably also meant the quality of economic environment, including freedom of enterprise and control of corruption, because that, of course, affects productivity. Whereas the freedom of enterprise certainly raises productivity. Alexei, my colleague, just spoke about the social contract, which may have been tacitly understood in the first years of Mr. Putin's presidency. In the Ukraine, this tacit social contract was somewhat different. Under President Kuchma, the government said, you feed yourselves however you wish, you may even forget about paying taxes, but don't meddle with what we do. So this may in turn be somewhat accounting for the differences between Russia and the Ukraine. Economically speaking, Russia is the mineral superpower. How do our speakers see this difference between the limitations on the illiberal regimes? How long can illiberal regimes survive on their resources? And what is the role of resources for the democratic countries? Is there a need for change in institutions? Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid we can't take any more questions. We may have to confine ourselves to those that have already been asked. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. So many easy questions. Global space, traditional jobs, robots, artificial intelligence is of course a big thing that people in economics talk about a lot nowadays. I think for me the key factor here is again, how do we deal with taxation and our sort of welfare systems, etc. Because with this, it's not only that people may lose their jobs to robots, but you have such wealth concentration that comes with the digital economy, and you have it in companies that can choose to headquarter wherever they want, and they happen, for some strange reason, to headquarter in the countries that don't charge them any taxes. So, you know, that kind of tax competition in combination with a digital economy that doesn't really pin you down in terms of where you need to have your productive base, in combination with people losing their jobs. And in Sweden, you know, labor income tax is the big thing that is driving our welfare system. So what happens when you pull out sort of people from the labor force and at the same time concentrate the companies that now make enormous profits in the tax havens? That to me is one serious challenge to not only growth and sort of the welfare system, but also to democracy, because taxation and democracy and service delivery is sort of a nexus that comes together. So if you actually make it impossible for governments to tax these corporations that have basically replaced the workers that you used to tax, what do we do next? So, you know, we really need to think about a global system for taxing some of these super big and powerful digital companies that have just started to emerge. You know, you can actually go beyond robots and AI. Think about the company that really invents clean, cheap energy. You know, let's say we could have fusion tomorrow, and some inventor or some companies sits on the patent for that, and you can make it safe and clean and etc. You know, a company like that would make Google or Facebook look like, you know, really kids in the schoolyard. You know, we have in front of us, I think, enormous challenges in this regard that can in one way save humanity, because these are inventions that are going to potentially make our life much better, but it could actually undermine the whole idea of sort of taxation and democracy. So I think this is not something a Swedish politician or a UK or a Russian can solve. This has to be on a global scale, and I don't see what institutions we have today that can deal with it. So that's maybe for you to solve. The other thing that I may say something about is this thing with natural resources and autocracy and Dutch disease and how you deal with that. I mean, one of my colleagues at SITE has been doing a lot of research about that, and the common feature is that if a country finds their oil or minerals before they have created the right institutions and political institutions, that's not good news. That usually comes with very difficult times then creating these institutions. A counterexample that was not by design but by luck, I guess, was again Norway. Norway had a good political system, the right property rights institutions, and then found the oil, Then it sort of works. But I mean, history has shown us that if you start with finding your natural resources, it's really, really difficult for the political system to create the non-extractive institutions following that. So, I mean, it's not the solution, it's just an observation on that thing. This thing with the liberal regimes and the connection between material wealth and freedom. Again, I think we have to remember that, inequality and well-being, it's not just about money, it's also being able to express your opinions and feeling that you have opportunities and so on. So, that is already enough for me to say that freedom is extremely important in its own right. And that's not always connected to the highest growth rate, as we can see with China. But again, we have to remember that China is not sort of the average country in the world. And in most of the authoritarian and non-free countries, economic development has certainly been worse. And there are a lot of papers discussing that. So I think we should still go with the freedom as the best way of doing these things.
Спасибо. Я тогда, наверное, может быть, сконцентрируюсь на вопросе.
I will concentrate, if I may, about the question of productivity, because after all, this was one of the key points in my presentation. When I talk about productivity, I didn't only mean labor productivity, because it's apparently only one of the economic fields. So let us imagine for a moment an economy a hypothetical economy based on sharpening pencils. Let us say the only thing that this economy does is sharpen pencils. And I have a pencil sharpener. That's my capital. We have labor and we have services and goods. So if I am a worker, if I have a pencil sharpener, I may sharpen, say, it's a big, good mechanical sharpener, let's just say 20 seconds. So that means I can sharpen 3 pencils a minute. Now, if we increase capital, I'm given one other pencil sharpener. So I can now have, I have 2 hands, I can rotate the 2 knobs, so I can have 6 pencil sharpeners. So that means that the GDP has risen twice because we now have sharpened more pencils. Now let us imagine that I'm given the 3rd pencil sharpener. Well, unfortunately, I don't have a 3rd hand, so I won't be able to sharpen 9 pencils. What is the solution here? What's the way out for the long-term prosperity in such an economy? It's an electric pencil sharpener, which will be sharpening 1 pencil in 5 minutes. And so this electric sharpener is an example of productivity growth. So the reason why I want I'm giving this as an illustrating this is that entrepreneurship, when sharpeners are given, is a very important part of our ecosystem. But I would not really call it as the only reason. Because entrepreneurs, whereas they're the only locomotives, because unless there is a technology for electric sharpener, unless there is R&D, engineers, scientists, then entrepreneurs themselves will not be will not be able to deal with that.
And this is where they can work. The role of entrepreneurs is exactly to organize labor with all others, like their workers, like researchers, like engineers, you name it. This is probably the way to go. I will remember the Soviet economy, the times where Soviet economy kept sharpening the pencils, never realizing how many are needed and why. Why on earth they're doing it? Because it was planned economy. And suddenly when market came, it turned out nobody needs them. That's why there are problems about demand. I suppose this is an excellent metaphor to end this panel on economy. And we all, with our pencils, are adjourning for lunch and taking up pencils.